You've all heard the raging debates that are taking place in public schools about teaching critical race theory and subjects related to race and racism and what impact this has on white children, on Black children, and Black teachers. And you've probably seen me interview several Black educators about how they are navigating this new reality in public schools. Well, today I'm talking to two white educators about what it means to be a white teacher in a public school during this very partisan culture wars that schools and school districts find themselves in. Coming up next are the authors of Learning and Teaching While White, Anti-Racist Strategies for School Communities.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Sitting down with co-authors of the book, Learning and Teaching While White, Anti-Racist Strategies for School Communities. Authors Jenna Chandler Ward and Elizabeth Devney are both educators, they're diversity trainers, and they are the founders of Teaching While White. Good morning and welcome, Jenna and Elizabeth.
Good morning.
First question, why this book and why now?
Well, I think we both wanted to write the book that we wish we had had when we were teachers. And I think given everything that's out there now, as you said, what's happening in the greater community, certainly schools are not separate from what's going on. And so we wanted to be able to give tools to teachers, to parents, to school leaders, so that they are prepared. They can answer questions thoughtfully when parents want to know, why are we talking about race in schools? And they can feel confident. And they can really make sure they're serving the children who are before them every day.
So, Jenna, what's the response been like? We've heard a lot about barbecuing while Black, napping while Black, and all of these everyday normal things that African Americans do, and then this phrase while Black. So you all, kind of took a twist on that, the statement while Black, and you have this book called Learning and Teaching While White. So I'm just curious as to how the book has been received by both white educators and also African American educators.
Well, it's definitely a provocative title, and we are playing on that phrasing. And just to note that over 80% of our teachers in this country are white. Most of them don't know that whiteness matters or that their whiteness impacts their teaching and learning. And so we really wanted to highlight that, and that there is some danger when white teachers aren't aware of their racial identity and how it impacts a learning environment. So very much trying to allude to that. White teachers are definitely have a lot of questions when they talk with us, wanting to know what we're talking about. Why are we suggesting there might be danger? Mostly we are met from teachers of color with enthusiasm and gratefulness for making it explicit.
And you raise a good point, Jenna, about bringing awareness about white teachers, bringing their whiteness into the classroom. And I've been having this conversation a lot, Elizabeth, with different authors, from Koa Beck, who writes about white feminism, to Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the very popular book White Fragility. And in talking with both of those authors, they talk about the backlash and how difficult it is for white people to even accept, in many cases, that there is systemic racism in our country, to accept that racism is a part of many of our institutions, including our public education institution. So again, I'm just curious as to how difficult it is to first get white teachers to acknowledge that racism exists in public education.
Well, I think we've been lucky, I would say, over the last couple of years that it's gotten very difficult now for white teachers to sort of deny what's going on. So I think we've seen a little bit of space open up over our long careers of folks saying, maybe something is happening here I need to pay attention to. So I'm hopeful, because I feel like folks now are paying a little bit more attention, like, maybe I do need to know more about this. So I think we've been encouraged, that folks want to know more. I think what's challenging for white folks, and I'm sure your other authors said this as well, is that we don't want to believe that we're racist. We don't want to believe that we're doing things to harm people, especially teachers. Teachers don't wake up in the morning and think, who can I be racist towards today? Most of them, that's not the way they operate. And so I think that whole suggestion that racism is happening, white people see it as, oh, you're calling me a bad person. And I think what we want to say is to help teachers and say, no, look, you want to do the best you can by the kids and the families that you serve. There's this thing that's happened in this country for over 500 years. We need to pay attention to it. We need to know how it operates. And then we need to know how to dismantle it. So let's get busy and stop defending our intentions and get busy owning our actions and being accountable for making sure that all children are allowed to learn to the best of their abilities in schools and don't have to face racism in our classrooms.
What about parents? Because, as I mentioned in the opening, there are these raging battles that are taking place in mostly school board meetings. And it's not the majority of parents, but they are a loud minority, and they have captivated the media. They've kind of, dominated the narrative. So how are parents, those that may have access to this book, how are they responding, Jenna, to a book that's about the role that white teachers play in educating kids?
Yeah, there's actually a chapter specific for parents about why we need to talk about race with white students, with our white children, and how to do it, and sort of the collective impact that white parents are having on public education, partially what you named. I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of fear mongering, right? So we can, all of us who are parents, relate to that wanting to protect our own, and, this notion that they're being harmed at school and made to be feeling guilty or bad about themselves, when in fact that's not what's happening at all. And the less we actually talk about race, the more that happens. We tend to only name whiteness in this paradigm of oppressor and oppressed, and we don't name that there have always been white anti-racists involved in the struggle, and that there are different ways to be white, and that if we only ever name whiteness in connection to oppression and the atrocities that are real in this country, then we only have one model for being white. And so I want parents to think, this is actually an opportunity to have conversations with our white children about what's going on with race, because in the absence of that discussion, kids are filling in the blanks themselves with whatever's available to them, media messages, whatever they're seeing online, and they are absorbing those messages. And so silence is never neutral, and I think parents want to believe that if we don't talk about it, they won't know about it, but what we've seen time and time again is that is not the case. And without the conversation, we're letting other people educate our kids and our children in the ways that they want to. And we open them up to all sorts of things, including recruiting by white supremacist organizations when we're not having those conversations.
No, that's an excellent point. And I do wonder, Elizabeth, how receptive teachers are to teaching about what Jenna just identified as some of those anti-racist white people that have been a part of movements, including obviously the civil rights movement. Who are some of those key figures that you think need to be talked about more, but who aren't, ever talked about or rarely talked about in most public schools?
Well, someone who's been very important to me, because I'm Italian-American, and Viola Liuzzo was an Italian-American who was a white woman who heard Martin Luther King's call when he was down in Selma to have folks come and be able to allow folks to vote. And so she headed down to Alabama and was there and supported the civil rights movement and really helped to drive voters, to be able to go to voting stations. Unfortunately, she was murdered. She was shot by the KKK because of her activism. But it's really important for me to know somebody who looks like me stood in solidarity with African Americans to ensure their right to vote. And I never ever knew the names of any of those people growing up. I never had any of those models. And of course, people of color, and in particular African Americans during the civil rights movement, they've always been fighting for their liberation. They've always been challenging racism. And there have been white folks throughout history who have supported them. So Viola Liuzzo is one name that I hope folks will take a look at and will know.
Yeah, I must admit, I've never heard about Viola. She seems like an amazing hero, shero, that we definitely should learn about in school. And I'm sure, as you said, there's so many others that don't, make their way into our history books. Let's talk a little, Jenna, about the role that white people can play in dismantling racism, particularly in the context of public education. And when you do that, I want to, have this conversation in the backdrop of these states like Florida, where you've had these very active governors, you had these active legislators who are making it more difficult for teachers to talk about race, who are penalizing teachers who are teaching about race. So how can a school teacher who maybe want to model herself after Viola do so if she's in a state like Florida?
Yeah, there's all sorts of tricky things to navigate with these new laws and legislation that are coming out. I think the number one thing is to name ourselves as white, to stop allowing whiteness to go as this invisible, unnamed thing. So just even a teacher saying, well, I'm white, and so in my lived experience, I've never had that happen to me. Just making that explicit is a huge step. Or even naming an author, we tend to only name the race of an author if it's somebody who's not white. So just being conscious of all the ways we make whiteness the default and the norm, and making it as explicit as possible. And I think modeling, saying, I'm really troubled by what's going on in this country, being careful, of course, about what we say, but showing students that there is a different way to be white, that it's not about feeling guilt and shame, that there's actually some empowerment once we're able to understand how whiteness has impacted our lives and how we can start to undo what's happened. But over 84% of our teachers are white, and if nobody's talking about it, there's a huge vacuum that's happening.
It's interesting that you say that, Jenna. Elizabeth, I don't know if you all know Mary Frances Winters, because you're both diversity trainers, and Mary Frances is like the godmother of diversity training. She's been, 30, 40 years in the business, and I've talked with her quite extensively about this issue, particularly after George Floyd, when she said diversity training was the hottest thing for corporations, and they were spending, millions of dollars bringing in diversity trainers. And she said over time, as we got further away from George Floyd's murder, that she had a class, a corporate class that she was teaching, or one of her trainers was teaching, and someone said, can the trainer stop using the word white? That it was making the employees feel uncomfortable. So when did we get to this point, Elizabeth, in our country where the very word white made white people feel uncomfortable?
Well, I think we've been uncomfortable for a really long time. I think we're just been emboldened in some ways to be able to say it out loud. And I always say—
But hold on, let me ask you this. I'm thinking back to movies and novels that I read coming out of the Civil War. And people who were white were very proud to be white. So they talked very proudly about being white men, white women. So we haven't always been in this space where being white was negative. But yet, fast forward to 2021 or so, Mary Frances is having this experience where white people in a company are telling her, can we come up with another word to describe the white people in the room other than using white? So that's what I'm trying to figure out. Where do we go from white being a badge of honor and it being a good thing to be white to now somebody white saying it makes me uncomfortable when you call me white?
Got it. Thank you for clarifying. I think what's interesting is that I think white folks want to acknowledge that the civil rights movement happened, racism is over. So how dare you come back again now and say that there's something wrong or that racism still exists? And I think now when we have evidence of racism, like the murder of many African Americans that's happened across this country, it gets more difficult for white folks to sort of deny. And so I think now the next move, and we like to talk about sort of the shape shifting of how we're going to sort of defend ourselves from being racist. Now the move is, oh, don't call me white. That makes me uncomfortable, because really what they're saying is you're calling them racist. And so, Jenna and I like to say, what if being called racist were the beginning, not the end of the conversation? What if white people could be curious and be able to say, oh my gosh, is there something that I just said? Oh, I was unaware. Please tell me more. But we don't talk about it. Folks don't know. We don't model for each other. And so again, the best way to shut down the conversation is to say, you don't even get to call me white. And it's been very effective because then folks panic and they don't know what to say. And so the strategies work. And I think that's what I mean by it's been around for a long time. I think white folks for a long time have found ways around confronting racism. And what we hope with the book and in this moment is that we can really say enough. Enough is enough. Stop the defensiveness. Stop trying to blame it on everybody else, not me. It's those white people. It's the Ku Klux Klan. It's the Proud Boys. I'm fine, right? Nothing else is going on. And really being able to say, I might have a role here. But folks are, when white folks feel uncomfortable, this is not something they're used to feeling uncomfortable about their race. They're used to being in charge. They're used to, especially in corporate situations, running the world. And any little bit of discomfort really can destabilize folks. One thing Jenna and I have done that's been really helpful is to sort of name that at the beginning of our trainings, is to say to white teachers or leaders or white parents who we're working with, there may be moments where you feel uncomfortable. Pay attention to it. This may happen. Be aware of it. Tell us where it's going on. It's a really important sign of your learning, and we're actually going to push through it. And we have found that to name it and say that it's coming has made a huge difference for many of the folks that we work with.
Yeah, Jenna, we've seen some pretty bizarre, I'll call it, and even hurtful examples of teachers using like slave auctions and things of that nature to teach history, and then defending it or attempting to defend it by saying we didn't, it was just demonstrative, we didn't know it would be hurtful. Even certain teachers using the N-word while teaching certain literature. What do you make of those examples? And how is it in 2021, 2022 that a white teacher would not know that a slave auction is a bad idea?
Yeah. Well, I do believe that most teachers attempt to do what they do in the name of helping folks. And I think racial isolation is so prevalent in this country. And there is an element of willful ignorance, but also we're never taught about this in school, right? This is the issue that we're dealing with. So it's coming back full circle, but it's also not taught in teacher training programs. There's no racial literacy that is required of teachers to be in schools. Mm-hmm. And so I think oftentimes in this situation,
I got to stop you, Jenna. So you're saying 84% of all teachers in public schools are white. We know the majority of kids in most public schools are Black and brown, particularly in big urban areas. And white teachers go through no training about how to work with Black and brown communities, children, their parents. They're just thrown in without any effort to address the big elephant in the room?
That's right. I have a master's in cross-cultural education, and I was required to take one diversity class. And most teachers aren't given even that. And it's that same notion of, I don't care if my kids are blue, purple, green, or red, we treat them all the same, this belief, and that we don't see the race of our students, which is simply not true. It's been proven and disproven 1,000 times. So no, teachers are not equipped. And that's part of what we hope to do with this book, is to get into teacher training programs, because we want to stop the harm before it starts, right? And so many teachers are walking into those classrooms that are predominantly Black and brown students with no racial literacy. And they think that these reenactments, which we basically in this book say, please just skip the reenactments, just don't do them, right? That oftentimes it's this thought, well, I'm going to burst their bubble, or they don't know about these atrocities and it's my job to teach them. And the best way to teach it is for them to experience a taste of it. And so
I guess you're right. I mean, we've gone through this period in this country with this whole notion of color blindness, right? I don't see color. All kids are the same. It doesn't matter. And somehow, again, if you're bringing up race, sometimes you're called a racist for even talking about race, or you're divisive. That happens to me often on this show. People call me a racist because I talk a lot about race. So I guess I shouldn't be as surprised. And when I think about it, I'm really not surprised. But it's still disturbing nonetheless. success, right? That we are as evolved as we are in some ways in this country, but yet we are so far behind on these really important topics. Let's talk about critical race theory. Again, this big umbrella term, more honestly, a legal concept taught in legal, a part of legal education in law schools, not widely taught outside of graduate school programs, professional school programs, but yet has become this umbrella term, this, really bad, horrible term that a lot of white legislators in the South, red states, want to use to, again, somehow make it a bad thing to talk about race. And everything gets pushed under this umbrella of critical race theory. So help us understand how in the book you deal with critical race theory.
Well, as you so well described where it came from. Back in the 1980s, we were trying to explain the racial disparities that had persisted in spite of the civil rights movement. So we had this movement, but look what's happening. By any measure, we still see that this racial discrimination is rampant throughout our society. What's happening? Without critical race theory, really, we're just blaming Black and brown people and saying it's their fault. Why can't they just get ahead, right? We don't know what's wrong. We had a civil rights movement. Everything's good. And so critical race theory is really important to be able to say there are systems that have been put in place in this country since its founding, right, to be able to make sure that we have these ongoing racial disparities. So some can profit and some will not. And so I think really understanding that it's a system, and if we don't have critical race theory, then again, we're just gonna blame people for what's happening to them. So again, you're right. We don't teach it in schools necessarily. I get to teach it in my graduate school program, and my students are so grateful for the framework, and they find it really helpful. But again, this is another tactic to be able to say, I'm uncomfortable. And so if I can name this thing and say that's bad, again, a very effective campaign. We want parents and teachers to be well educated and know talking about race isn't necessarily critical race theory, but what it means is that we understand that we're not going to blame kids or blame families or blame people for the racial discrimination they're experiencing. We're going to be insightful and thoughtful about where it comes from. We're going to talk about ways that we can interrupt it and challenge it. And kids know, I always say white kids, parents will say, oh, I think my children feel guilty and shameful, when they have to talk about being white. And I said, when I talk with white students, you know what they feel bad about? They feel bad about racism. They know racism is this horrible thing. They have friends who are Black and brown who they see things happening and they're like, why is my friend being treated differently than me? Again, we don't give them the words to help them know what's happening. Then they may end up blaming their friends or thinking it's something about them or thinking it's something about their family or something they said. So it's a really important structure. It just really talks about racism as a system, that it's operating in all these different ways. It's not just about a bad white person here or there doing or saying something that doesn't seem fair. And so I hope that we can continue to talk about the importance of how important it is to talk about racial identity. We need to be talking about race, and that's actually the only way that we're going to dismantle racism.
Yeah, and Jenna, we've seen this whole issue around critical race theory also get expanded to even conversations about the Holocaust, and some states and some school districts trying to prevent honest conversations about the Holocaust for fear, again, that it's going to make some kids uncomfortable, maybe Jewish kids, maybe German kids. Again, how do we address that? How do we have conversations about history and teach factual things that happened in our country and in other countries in the world without this fear that somebody goes home feeling, that the finger has been pointed at them personally?
Yeah, the Holocaust is an interesting phenomenon because we also get told that we are reenacting the Holocaust by talking about race, that without the discussion, we're causing segregation, which will ultimately lead to the next Holocaust. So it's been used in all sorts of ways. And what we know is the more we can talk about race in whatever circumstance, then we give kids a more nuanced understanding beyond you are bad or good simply because of the color of your skin. And we give frameworks, like Elizabeth talked about, understanding systems, right? Like all of the honors and advanced classes tend to have more white students in them. It's not because they are inherently superior based on the color of their skin, and not all of the Black and brown students are defective because of the color of their skin. It's simply just a lie. And we need to be having those conversations. Kids can handle complexity beyond what we think they can, and they ask for it all the time. They're begging for it. Please help us. Tell us what's going on, because we're seeing it on the news, we're seeing it on the internet, and nobody is talking to us about it. White kids, I should say. Nobody's talking to white kids about it. And so they're left to fill in those blanks.
Yeah, Elizabeth, kids go home. So teachers may read this book, they may take away some great strategies, how to be an anti-racist, how to teach anti-racism, but kids go home to parents, and we know, by political breakdown in this country, half the country almost, or 80 million people, voted for Donald Trump. And not to say that people voted for Donald Trump are automatically racist, but we know the majority of people that voted for him are white. And we can extrapolate from that many of those white people that voted for him, display their whiteness in the ways that are not very helpful as we're trying to work through issues of race and racism. So if you are a kid and you live in one of those households and you go home to, a set of those parents who are watching Fox News and they're spewing all of this hate and images, creating these, false images and perpetuating these tropes about Black and brown people, how are kids supposed to combat that?
Well, I think we encourage schools to be in better partnerships with parents and to be really explicit about the work that they're doing with the mission of schooling so that kids can learn. What's really important to remember is that when children are under any kind of discrimination in schools, when they're having to face discrimination, or we have white children who may be perpetuating those racial stereotypes and saying or doing things, right, then that gets in the way of learning whenever we have any kind of discrimination operating. And so really schools are in the business of teaching and learning. And so we like to say, stand by your mission, explain why you need to talk about this so that all children are ready and available to learn. This is why we're going to talk about it. This is why it's connected. We have really good research, decades of research about why it's important. So I think being on the affirmative, really saying, this is what we're doing and this is why we want to do it, because it's the mission of our district. Here's what we talk about. All districts, I mean, even if you look in the middle of America, if you jump on a website and look at what schools are saying they want to do, most of them have statements, or almost all of them have these statements about, we want all children to come to school and feel valued and learn and do their best work, right? Be able to have academic success in our district. Well, that's predicated on us removing forms of discrimination. So I think connecting those dots, making sure parents understand what's happening, and providing parent education. Remember, those parents are terrified because they didn't have these conversations in school. They have no idea how to have these conversations. They feel wildly uncomfortable. So the easiest thing to do is to blame the school. So we have opportunities where we've partnered with districts. We bring in parents, we give them an opportunity to practice these conversations, talk about how they did or didn't talk about race when they were younger and how they can have productive conversations with their students. It doesn't stop every squeaky wheel, but I do think then the majority of parents have the talking points to say, hey, this is why we're talking about it at school. And they can help echo the message so it doesn't just fall on superintendents or school leaders or the classroom teacher having to defend themselves. Parents can start talking to other parents and saying, hey, let's listen a little bit more. Let's learn some more. Let's figure out what's happening before we get so angry and demand that the curriculum change.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I guess, Jenna, I'm just still incredulous about a teacher being able to talk to a 7-year-old about race if that 7-year-old lives in a house where, again, they're bombarded with messages from Fox News or other conservative news outlets that portray immigrants coming across the border or portray African Americans as dangerous criminals. how is that 7-year-old, again, going to be able to process what they're seeing in their house that's on their television, throughout the day, evening when they're at home, with what a teacher may be trying to do in a classroom?
Yeah, it's a complicated dynamic, but it's, in a sense, code switching, right? Which many of our kids have to do every day anyway, where there are certain things they know kids of color can talk about at school and certain things that they don't and only talk about at home, right? So that dynamic is not new. I think giving those kids those opportunities and saying, here at school, we believe that everyone's full humanity and dignity is essential and that we are going to protect that. And that's what happens at school. And whatever happens at home is whatever happens at home. But at school, we are not allowing anyone's humanity or dignity to be under threat.
Have you had any teachers in these trainings that you guys have done, Elizabeth, about the book or about these strategies, who've just rejected them, who've said, no, it's not our place either to teach this, or one, I don't believe this, because teachers have their own beliefs as well. I mean, again, as much as we'd like to think that they are just teaching the curriculum, I'm thinking of every teacher I had. It's very rare, I would say, for a teacher not to infuse that lesson with their own lived experiences, their own personal beliefs. So have you had teachers who just pushed back and said no?
Yeah, we have, and usually it's a form of interesting kinds of resistance that folks may sort of cross their arms and sit back. They sort of are unwilling to participate. I've had teachers pull out their papers to start grading, so they're very obviously in front of you like, I'm not listening to a word that you're saying.
Right.
And really in those moments, I mean, what we try to do is, again, we know blame and shame. We're not blaming and shaming white kids. We're certainly not going to blame and shame adults. But I think what's important in those moments is we try to pivot to their peers that are sitting around them, that are working with them every day, and saying, how are you going to engage your colleagues who have not had the opportunity or are unwilling to have these conversations? So really enlisting more white people to talk to their friends, talk to their colleagues, and stop remaining silent or letting comments go by. I said, you need to talk to your colleague after the faculty meeting. And in trainings, we've often said, we will say, we know some of you have very actively not been participating today. You've made it very clear that this is not someplace you want to be. Right? Just stating reality. And we will say, I hope for the colleagues in the room who found the training valuable, who don't want to continue to do racial harm to students, I hope you will talk with your colleagues. It was very clear in the room who you were. So I hope you'll get a chance to talk with them, because clearly they are not seeing the importance of this work. And if we don't do that, then we will harm kids, we will harm families, the discrimination will continue. So that's been one way. We don't let it go by, but I'm also not, we try not to get into it in the middle, because you do have folks, I would say the vast majority are interested in what we have to say, because so often they've never had these conversations, or they've heard it from a person of color and weren't ready to listen, or didn't believe them, or somehow in some way thought, oh, you're just saying that because you were this racial background. When you have to hear it from someone who shares your racial background, I think in some ways you can have a different impact, because oftentimes we don't hear other white people having these conversations. And so I think folks are a little bit caught off guard in a way, and may listen in some ways that, even though our colleagues of color say the exact same things, they often aren't willing to listen in the same ways because of racism, right?
So Jenna, are you starting to see any changes, one, in the curriculum that schools use to teach new teachers? Or are we starting to get more than that one diversity training class that you got in a master's program? You didn't even get it in your undergraduate, and a lot of teachers start teaching before they have their master's degree. So are we seeing any changes in how the teaching institutions are teaching white teachers?
It's been slow going. I would say I've seen more changes at the graduate level. I still am not seeing a lot of required courses. And even if there is a required course, what is the sort of accountability and literacy that we're checking for, right, before we let teachers have their own classrooms? I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area. It's a place that Elizabeth and I really want to focus on, because we have a system that is just replicating itself, and we really need some more interventions early on.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I've interviewed lots of teachers, lots of school superintendents, lots of teacher union leaders, and I know from talking to all these folks that teachers feel under siege, particularly with COVID. They've had to do the remote learning. They've had to make adjustments in their classroom, mask wearing, no mask wearing. They're caught in those battles in some states about, the use of masks on school campuses. That became a highly politicized issue. Vaccines, also highly politicized. So when I think about the life of the everyday teacher, I'm just wondering, where does this topic fit in with all the things that they are trying to manage? The kids that got left behind academically, the mental health issues that teachers are having to deal with because kids were out for 2 years. We run a program, Special Needs Network, a summer program, and we hire high school and college students, and we had the hardest time this year for our summer camp hiring them. And the hiring agents told us that the kids didn't want to go back outside, that they were so traumatized from COVID, from everything that's happened, that they weren't even willing to get a job like at a summer camp, which used to be every kid's dream, I guess, to work, as a summer camp counselor. So how do you fit in this conversation about race and racism in the schedule of teachers who are already bombarded with so much?
It's a great question. I think what we've really tried to think about is healthy classrooms, healthy schools, healthy kids will be able to learn and thrive. So that means we want children who are free from COVID, who are able to be healthy and show up. We also want them free from discrimination. We want to be challenging issues of poverty, racism, any of these things that sort of get in the way. And so we try to sort of thread these conversations into all these other barriers, right? Anything else that might sort of get in the way of children being able to show up and do their best work. And when we do, I have the opportunity here in the Pacific Northwest, I train teachers to be principals. And what's really exciting about the teachers that I'm working with is they actually, to see it all connected and to understand it all comes from the same place. Like this is all the same conversation has been really helpful. And I think they are relieved. They are happy to have good information. So I think, yes, they are overwhelmed. And I think we need to name that. But I think in the ways that we can really put these things together and start them, let them see the puzzle. Right now, I think we like to scatter 100 pieces at them and say, good luck to you. And I think if we can sort of prevent a vision that says, healthy communities that are thriving, that are free from any kinds of things that are going to get in the way, then children are going to do better. And so we've had a lot of gratitude from teachers. They're thankful. They feel like they have the tools they need. They can speak. And it's actually one thing they can do. It can be hard to fight poverty in your community and to know how you're going to challenge that, to know that I could have books in my classroom that challenge stereotypes of Black and brown kids, even if my classroom is filled entirely with white kids. If I know they can at least, the stereotypes they may be seeing at home, they're not going to see in my classroom because I'm going to vet all my curriculum materials. I'm going to put positive images forward. That is something I can do. And I think that notion of empowerment, a move they can make, has been really helpful to the teachers that we work with.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up, Elizabeth, the book issue, because we've also seen, as a part of this whole attack on critical race theory and the teaching of race in classrooms, is an attack on books. We did a show about books that have been banned in states. We looked at Florida, and this teacher came up with this creative idea. He set up a GoFundMe account. He raised a lot of money so that he could buy books, and then he has to place them in coffee shops and other businesses in his community because he can't use these books in the classroom. So how likely is it, Jenna, that a teacher could even have a book? I think The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison's, iconic novel about race and racial identity, it was banned from the classroom, and there were just, a slew of other books like that.
Yeah, this is an ongoing struggle, and I don't want to minimize it at all. And teachers, like you mentioned, are being very creative in how they're getting stories out to students. I've seen teachers who are teaching short stories, right, because parents are less aware of those and maybe aren't able to specifically ban those as needed. Finding different ways to have the conversation, or even through a text where all the characters are white and the author is white, talking about how does whiteness impact the story. Again, making that explicit. We are still talking about race, but we're not reading this particular author that you're worried will indoctrinate our children.
Yeah, so Elizabeth, final takeaways. Give us two, high level strategies that you would recommend parents use to talk to their kids, their white kids, about not just race but whiteness, because that's a term that is starting to be used more. I don't think wasn't in our vernacular. I don't even 5 years ago, you didn't hear people talking a lot about whiteness. So it's a concept that kids now are going to hear more about. So how does a parent talk to their kids about this?
I think the best place parents can start is by telling their own stories of growing up and how they were or were not aware of race. Jen and I often hear, and we ask parents to think about their earliest moments of when they recognized race or they thought about race or where did it come up. And so I think one thing the book can be very helpful is we share our own stories of how we were raised and growing up. And I think it provides a lot of ways that folks can then come in and think about their own background. So one is think about your own stories and tell your own stories. Sometimes it doesn't seem like your kids are listening. They always are. And so they will absorb that. I also feel like parents being able to just, if you see things or you see driving, you're out, you're shopping, you're doing other things, just that noticing and being able to say, that's really interesting. I wonder what's going on there. Boy, I've noticed a lot of these people are shopping here, but we don't have a lot of other people who don't look like us here at the store. I wonder why that's happening, right? Even ways of just pointing out these disparities and opening questions up can be really helpful, because then the 7-year-old can say, yeah, Mom, why is that? And we can say, wow, tell you the story of this neighborhood. When this neighborhood was first founded, guess what? People who look like us were able to live here. And so now when we go to the grocery store, most people look like us because that was actually the law in our town. Those ways that we can help process, put those things forward, I think can be really helpful to parents.
The majority of us are not educators, aren't in classrooms, aren't influencing kids as a teacher, although we have influence over kids. So what can non-educators get out of the book?
I think the book really is for most anyone who has youth in their lives, and there is a parent specific to a chapter specific to parents to talk about those strategies. And I think it's just how we are talking about race around our kids or not talking about race around our kids, because we know that silence about this is violence, that there is no neutral. And so we want all white adults who have youth in their lives to be aware, to be able to talk about it, so that the next Dylan Roof or the next Kyle Rittenhouse has lots of adults in their lives, and that somebody can step in and prevent these things from going forward.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Good luck with the book. Again, it's Learning and Teaching While White: Anti-Racist Strategies for School Communities. And as Jenna just said, there's something in this book for everyone. You don't have to be a teacher or a principal or a school administrator. There's a fantastic chapter geared just towards parents, and lots of lessons that we can learn, as Jenna said, for all of us who have children in our lives, and that's probably most of us. So don't worry that this book is just for teachers. It really isn't. It's for all of us. And thank you guys so much for having the courage to write it and for going around the country trying to disrupt what's happening in school districts and in classrooms, and to try to empower the next generation of white kids and getting folks comfortable saying white. It's okay. White. We can say it. White. It's okay. We have to get comfortable. Just like we say very comfortably someone is black, we have to say very comfortably someone is white. But again, thanks to both of you for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I want to thank my guest this morning for having the courage to write this book. It takes a lot of courage for white folks to call out other white folks. And having interviewed lots of white authors, I know the backlash that they receive. And myself, I've told you guys the story of the book that I'm working on, my 5th book, and how I had a white agent that I was pitching my book to come back to me and say, first of all, your book starts off with the premise that there is systemic racism in every everybody agrees with that. And then he goes on to tell me how everybody doesn't agree with that. And as we just learned from Jenna and Elizabeth, if we can't even admit and acknowledge something as pervasive and as well documented as systemic racism, we can't get very far with the conversation about race. I absolutely positively loved what Jenna said, and I'm going to use one of her quotes as my words to live by today. And what she said was that silence is never neutral. That's it. That's the words to live by today. Silence is never neutral. And what she means by that, and she said it, very well during the interview, which is not talking about race doesn't make race go away or racism go away. It doesn't make it any easier for white kids and black kids to get along and for white and black adults to live together harmoniously. It's still there. That elephant is still in the middle of the room. So let's stop pretending ourselves. We are not in a colorblind society, and no, white teachers, 84% of them going into black and brown kids, cannot be successful if we ignore race and racism. If we ignore what white kids are learning at home. We have to acknowledge those 80 million people that voted for Donald Trump, many of them are avid watchers of Fox News. And whether they call themselves racist or think of themselves as racist or not, they are watching hours and hours of programming that play into racist stereotypes, that tell them that black men in particular are dangerous, that black women are promiscuous, that Latino folks are shiftless, lazy immigrants that come into this country illegally and seek to rape and rob white women. So those are the images, those are the messages that are getting played out in homes across this country, and little white kids are hearing those messages and they have to be internalizing them. So no surprises that we are producing Dylan Roofs of the world and the shooter in Buffalo and some of these other mass murderers whose sole intention was to start a race war or to attack black people. And if we want to disrupt this, if we want to disrupt these white nationalists and white supremacists, we must not ever think that silence is neutral. Be safe out there, and remember, we are all in this together.